Let me say this slowly, because I need you to really hear it. I am 76 years old, and the most honest thing I can tell you right now is that the bravest moment of my entire life did not happen when I was young and strong and full of certainty. It happened at 69, when I walked away from a 45-year marriage and chose myself for the very first time. Go ahead and think what you want. I have heard it all, that I was selfish, that I was foolish, that a man my age ought to know better than to blow up everything he built. But here is what I need you to understand before you judge me. The explosion did not happen the day I left. The explosion had been happening quietly, slowly, invisibly, for decades. The day I walked out was not the day something broke. It was the day I finally admitted that something had been broken for a very long time. Before I tell you about leaving, I have to tell you about staying. Because staying is the part nobody wants to examine. Everybody wants the dramatic moment, the door closing, the new beginning. Nobody wants to sit with the long gray years before that. But that is where the real story lives. I married in 1976. I was 24 years old, full of ideas about what life was going to be, what kind of man I was going to become. Her name was Patricia. She was smart and beautiful and came from a family that carried itself with a certain dignity I admired. My parents approved. Our community celebrated us. I stood at that altar in my best suit, believing with my whole chest that this was the beginning of something lasting and good. And in some ways, I suppose it was, just not the ways I had imagined. The problems did not arrive loudly. That is the thing about a slow erosion. You do not notice it happening because there is no single moment you can point to. No earthquake. Just the ground becoming gradually softer underfoot, year after year, until one day you realize you are standing in sand and wondering how you got there. There was no dishonesty in the obvious sense, no screaming, no dramatic betrayal, but there was something else, something harder to name and in many ways harder to survive. There was the constant, quiet feeling of not being seen, of having opinions that were interrupted, ideas that were dismissed, dreams that were treated as inconveniences. A good man, I had been taught, provides. He shows up. He does not complain. And so I provided. I showed up, and I did not complain. For 45 years. About 8 years into the marriage, I had an idea I was genuinely excited about. I had been working the same factory job for years, steady and reliable, but never mine. And I had started imagining a barber shop. Not just somewhere for a quick haircut, but a real gathering place. Somewhere men from the neighborhood could sit and breathe and talk honestly without performing for anyone. I had been saving money for it quietly, doing the arithmetic on napkins late at night, feeling the particular quiet electricity of a dream that might actually be possible. When I told Patricia, she looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something mildly embarrassing. "We have stability," she said. "You have a pension coming. Why would you risk everything for something like that?" And she said it with such complete certainty that my excitement shrank inside me like something living suddenly deprived of light. I put the idea away. I went back to the factory. I kept my head down and my dreams small. And every year that followed, that buried dream became harder to locate, like a letter you store somewhere safe and eventually cannot remember where you put it. We had 2 sons. And the moment those boys arrived, staying stopped being about the marriage at all and became about them. I knew too many men who had left their children without a father they could count on. I was not going to be that. I showed up to every game, every school event, every parent meeting. I was physically present for all of it, but I was only ever half there. The other half of me was somewhere else entirely, trying to remember what it had felt like to be fully alive. Patricia and I became very skilled performers. On Sunday mornings we sat together in church. At holidays we hosted the family, and everyone remarked on what a solid couple we were. From the outside, we looked like something worth aspiring to. Decades together, still standing. But inside that house, we were 2 people who had stopped truly speaking to each other somewhere along the way, and had quietly agreed not to mention it. We talked about bills and schedules and logistics. We slept in the same bed with a careful distance between us, like strangers sharing a train carriage who have already silently negotiated the armrest. I remember our 30th anniversary. Our sons organized a gathering. There were speeches about endurance and commitment, and what a rare thing it was to see a marriage hold together so long. I smiled through all of it. I thanked people warmly. I held my wife's hand when it seemed appropriate. And later that same night, when everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, I sat alone on the back step and cried. Not from gratitude, not from joy. From the particular grief of realizing I had spent 3 decades maintaining the appearance of a life rather than actually living one. The boys grew up and left, as children do. And when they left, the reason I had given myself for staying walked out the door with them. But I had been telling myself the same story for so long that I kept telling it out of habit. Too old now, too much invested, too much to unravel, too complicated, too late. At 68, my body made a decision my mind had been refusing to make. What started as exhaustion became chest pain and then became a doctor's visit I had been avoiding for months. The diagnosis was not a heart attack, which was the first thing I feared. It was depression, severe and long-standing. My body had been absorbing decades of suppressed grief and was finally presenting the bill. The doctor who told me this was young, perceptive, and looked at me with eyes that suggested she understood more than I had said. She told me I was not dying, but she told me I was not living either, and that my body had noticed the difference even when I had trained my mind to ignore it. She recommended therapy. I started seeing a counselor, a man a few years younger than me, and the first few sessions I could barely find words. Decades of keeping everything internal had calcified around my voice. I sat in that office looking at the carpet like a man waiting for a bus in the rain, not quite sure how long he has been standing there or whether the bus is still coming. But slowly I started talking about the marriage, about the dreams I had buried, about my father, who had spent his whole life in his own quiet, unhappy marriage, shrinking year by year until the man I remembered from my childhood was almost unrecognizable by the end. I had watched that happen. I had told myself I would never let it happen to me, and then, with tremendous dedication and consistency, I had done exactly the same thing. My counselor asked me one question that I have turned over in my mind almost every day since. He said, "If you found out you had 1 year left, would you spend it the way you are spending things right now?" The answer arrived before he had even finished the sentence. No, absolutely not. Then he asked why I was spending it that way, and I had no answer. There is no good answer to that question. There is only the uncomfortable silence where an answer should be. 3 months after that conversation, I told Patricia I wanted a divorce. She did not cry or raise her voice. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between confusion and a recognition she had not expected to feel. "After 45 years, she said. I told her quietly that we had not built 45 years together. We had stayed for 45 years. And those are not the same thing. The divorce was painful and slow and expensive and socially messy in the way these things always are. Some family members pulled away. Old friends from church spoke in whispers. My older son was furious, said I was dismantling the family he had grown up believing in. But my younger son called me one evening about a month after I had moved into my own place and said something I was not prepared for. He said, "Dad, I have never heard you sound like this before." He said he realized he had spent his whole life knowing his father's role, but not his father's self. That conversation opened something between us that had always been closed. We started talking the way I had always wished we could talk, about the real things, about what it costs to be a man trying to live honestly inside a world that hands you a script and expects you to follow it without deviation. At 70, for the first time in my entire life, I lived alone. A modest apartment, 2 bedrooms, on a quiet street. The silence some nights was enormous. There were mornings when I woke up genuinely unsure whether I had made an enormous mistake. Doubt visits everyone who makes a large, irreversible decision. That is simply part of it. But something else was also happening. Slowly, carefully, the way a plant grows toward light without being told to, I started recovering the man I had been before I had submerged him under half a century of obligation and performance. I remembered that I loved jazz, that I had always wanted to write poetry, but had been told it was not a practical use of time. I joined a community center. I started playing chess again, something I had abandoned years before when it was deemed a waste of useful hours. I went to poetry evenings at a bookshop on Friday nights and sat in the back and listened, and eventually began reading my own words aloud to a room full of strangers who received them without judgment. I made new friends, not people who knew me as someone's husband, someone's father, someone's reliable, useful presence. People who knew me simply as the man who showed up with his notebook and his opinions and his laugh. And eventually, I opened the barber shop. Not the grand version I had imagined at 30. A small place, 4 chairs, in a neighborhood that needed it. A place where men came not just for a haircut, but for the quiet dignity of being among people who understood them. Where grandfathers brought their grandsons for the first time, and where conversations happened that could not happen anywhere else. That shop became the closest thing I have ever had to a sanctuary that was entirely my own. Proof, built from scratch at 70 years old, that it is never actually too late. That the dream does not expire just because you stored it somewhere dark for a few decades. I am 76 now. My apartment is not large. My income is modest. Some evenings are lonelier than I would prefer, but I wake up each morning as myself, not as a performance of myself, not as the shape someone else decided I should fit, as the actual, complete, complicated living man I always was underneath all those years of making myself smaller. Here is what I know now that I could not let myself know then. The regret I carry is not about leaving. The regret is about the years I did not leave. Every year I told myself it was too late was a year I handed over voluntarily, and I will never get those years back. That is a real loss, and I am not going to pretend it is not. But I am also not going to spend whatever time I have remaining mourning time I cannot recover. Because that would be another way of disappearing, just a different method. If you are reading this from inside a life that looks acceptable from the outside, but feels like a slow suffocation from the inside, I want to say something to you directly. You are not too old. The years you have already spent do not obligate you to spend all remaining years the same way. That is not loyalty. That is not strength. That is a story you are telling yourself to avoid a frightening thing, and frightening things and wrong things are not the same. You will disappoint people if you choose yourself. You will be misunderstood. You will be called selfish by people who have confused your self-erasure with virtue. Let them call you what they like. You are not responsible for managing other people's comfort by continuing to diminish yourself. I spent 45 years being what every person around me needed me to be. I was a provider, a presence, a reliable structure that other people built their lives against. I was all of those things, and I am not ashamed of any of them. But I lost myself so completely in those roles that I stopped being able to find the man underneath them, the man who had a laugh that came easily, who wanted to make things and build things and say things that mattered, who deserved to take up space in his own life. That man was waiting. He had been waiting a very long time. And when I finally gave him permission to exist, he was still there. A little quieter than he used to be. A little more patient. But entirely, unmistakably himself. There is something you have been afraid to admit, even to yourself. I know there is, because we all have one. Some truth we keep pressing down because the moment it surfaces, we will have to do something about it, and doing something about it is terrifying. I am not asking you to act on it today. I am not even asking you to say it to anyone else. But stop pretending to yourself that it is not there. Write it down somewhere private. Say it quietly in an empty room. Acknowledge its existence, because that is where everything begins, not in the grand gesture or the dramatic exit. In the small private moment when you stop lying to yourself about what you actually need. It is not too late. I promise you it is not too late. I am 76 years old, and I am standing here as proof of that. The life you were meant to live is not somewhere in the past you have already moved through. It is in whatever comes next, but only if you are brave enough to stop performing and start living. That is everything I have, and it took me 69 years to learn it.